The stepmother pushes the millionaire's daughter in a wheelchair into the pool. She screams, "Please, Mom, I can't swim." But what no one expected is that the father saw everything and, at that moment, made her regret it. The sound of water splashing against the edge of the pool breaks the silence of the late afternoon. For Clara, sitting in her wheelchair beneath the sparse shade of a lemon tree, the noise was almost a lullaby, a steady rhythm that cradled the warmth of a fading day. The sun, already low on the horizon, painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, reflecting on the serene blue surface of the water like a mirror of dreams. On her lap, her tablet displayed the pages of an e-book, but her eyes were lost in the dance of the hydrangeas that adorned the mansion's veranda. The breeze carried the sweet scent of the flowers mixed with the citrusy aroma of the lemon tree and the unmistakable odor of chlorine, a combination that, until that moment, had meant safety. It had meant home. She adjusted the light blanket over her legs, an automatic gesture, while her fingers slid absently across the device's screen, a gift from her father that had become her voice when anxiety stole her words. The glass door leading to the living room slid open with a soft, almost inaudible whoosh. Beatrice appeared, impeccable in her white linen dress, her blonde hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that dared not challenge the humidity. On her face was the usual smile, perfectly designed for photographs and for her husband's business dinners, a smile that never reached her eyes. Clara felt a familiar shiver run down her spine, a tension that settled in her shoulders whenever her stepmother approached. "Enjoying the sun, darling?" Beatrice asked, her voice as smooth as a news anchor's. She walked toward Clara, her steps light on the manicured lawn. The glint of her gold jewelry caught the last rays of sunlight, casting small, dancing points of light around her. Clara merely nodded, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She tried to focus on the words of the book on her screen, but her stepmother's presence was too large, a shadow imposing itself on the tranquility of the garden. Beatrice stopped behind the wheelchair, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the handles. "It's getting a little chilly, don't you think? Let's go inside." Before Clara could protest, the chair began to move, but not toward the house. Beatrice was pushing her toward the edge of the pool, the rhythm of her steps subtly quickening. The sun hit Clara's eyes hard, and for an instant everything turned to glare and panic. The smell of chlorine became suffocating. The world tilted dangerously. "You need to learn not to be so much trouble," Beatrice's voice whispered, harsh and hissing, losing all its staged sweetness. "Your father spends a fortune to maintain all this luxury, and you just get in the way." The word fortune sounded like an insult. And then came the push, quick, firm, deliberate. What Beatrice didn't notice, however, was the small, discreet tap Clara's trembling thumb made on the tablet screen before the impact, a large red button programmed to send a silent alert to her father and the groundskeeper. The chair toppled, the world spun in a blur of blue and white, and the cold water enveloped her in a shocking, silent embrace. The first to arrive was Anthony, the groundskeeper. The alert on his phone vibrated with an urgency he had learned to respect, a silent sound that screamed louder than any siren. He dropped his pruning shears in the gardenia bed and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sight that met him made him freeze for a millisecond. The overturned wheelchair, one wheel still spinning slowly in the air, and Clara's small body submerged in the turquoise water. Without a second thought, he dove into the pool. The sound of his body hitting the water, the second loud noise of the afternoon. The water instantly soaked his work clothes, weighing down his movements, but he reached her in a few strokes. As he surfaced with the girl in his arms, gasping for air, he met Beatrice's gaze. She stood at the edge of the pool, her hands covering her mouth in a gesture of rehearsed horror. "She slipped!" she cried, her voice laden with a panic that sounded almost genuine. "My God, Anthony!" It was so fast. Anthony didn't answer. He just held Clara tighter, feeling the shudders that racked her body, and carried her to the safety of the lawn, away from the wet edge. It was at that exact moment that Richard's car screeched on the gravel driveway. A regional internet outage had dropped the connection to his international video conference, one of those meetings that decided the fate of major capital and which, by a whim of technology, had been cancelled. He was only minutes from home when Clara's alert vibrated on his car's dashboard. Now, jumping out of the car, his expensive suit wrinkled, he was confronted with the scene. Beatrice, her face bathed in tears, running toward him. Anthony, soaked, holding his trembling daughter in his arms, and the tablet, protected by its rubberized case, lying near the lemon tree. "Richard, thank God you're here," Beatrice sobbed, clinging to his arm. It was a terrible accident. The chair, it just slid. Richard's world, a universe of numbers, profits, and calculated dollar negotiations, seemed to crumble. He was a man who had built his wealth on analyzing facts, on a precise reading of scenarios. But here, the scenario was pure emotional chaos. He knelt beside his daughter, ignoring his wife for a moment. Clara's eyes were fixed on his, wide and terrified. She wasn't crying. Her shock was silent, profound. A violent tremor ran through her, and it wasn't just from the cold water. Richard took off his suit jacket and wrapped it around her, pulling her into his lap. His heart wanted to believe in innocence, in the tragedy of a simple accident. It was the easier path, the one that would keep the peace in his home, the stability of his family's assets. However, his daughter's eyes told a different story, a story without words, but one that screamed in silence. He looked at Anthony, who averted his gaze, and then at the tablet, the newly installed security system with audio recording capabilities, a requirement from the Homeowners Association, flashed through his mind. He knew that the truth, whatever it was, would leave scars. The wind blew, rustling the leaves of the trees, and Richard heard, or thought he heard, fragments of phrases recorded by the garden camera, clipped, distorted words. He stood up, with Clara nestled in his arms, and his look toward Beatrice was a confused mixture of pain and suspicion. "Let's go inside," he said, his voice firm but carrying an internal storm. In that instant, the mansion seemed to change. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt colder, the hallways longer and more somber. Injustice had taken root, and the smell of chlorine and lemon would never be the same. In the days that followed, the mansion changed. The sunlight, once an invitation to life in the garden, now seemed weaker, colder, as if passing through an invisible filter of sadness. The hallways, which had always echoed with the soft whir of Clara's wheelchair or the classical music Richard liked to listen to, became long tunnels of silence, a heavy, dense silence that no conversation could fill. Clara began to avoid the garden at all costs. The scent of hydrangeas mixed with chlorine, which once calmed her, now brought on a wave of nausea, a tightness in her chest that stole her breath. Paradise had become a prison, and the edge of the pool was a scar on the landscape of her childhood. Richard felt the change in every room, in every glance exchanged at the breakfast table. The business world, with its profitability charts and high-risk investment decisions, was simple compared to the complexity of that silence. He could manage a multi-million-dollar stock portfolio, but he didn't know how to fix the broken atmosphere of his own home. Determined to regain some control, he did what he always did when faced with a problem. He invested in solutions. He hired an occupational therapist, a woman with a kind gaze and an impeccable reputation, recommended by the best specialist in the city. At the same time, he called his IT team. "I want the backup of all security cameras configured on the cloud, immediately," he ordered, his voice firm. Not one to take no for an answer. "And I want you to review the recordings from the day of the accident, every second." It was a protocol, a way of seeking truth in data, the only language he truly mastered. Beatrice, sensing the activity, reacted with an exaggerated sweetness, a performance worthy of an award-winning actress. She appeared in Clara's room with a bouquet of vibrant sunflowers, saying they were to bring the sun back inside. At night, she prepared a corn chowder, her grandmother's special recipe, reminiscing with a nostalgic smile about the summer cookouts they used to enjoy together. But for Clara, the food was tasteless. Distrust was a bitter seasoning that spoiled any dish, no matter how sweet. When she felt her gestures of affection were not having the desired effect, that the atmosphere was slipping from her control, Beatrice deployed her first smokescreen. One evening, as Richard analyzed spreadsheets in his office, she entered with an expression of deep concern. In her hands were a few printed sheets of paper. "Honey, I didn't want to worry you with this," she began, hesitant, "but I overheard some conversations, and I received this." They were supposed text messages exchanged between household staff, insinuating that Clara had a history of making up stories to get her absent father's attention, that she had staged minor accidents before. The words were cruel, calculated to plant a seed of doubt. Richard read the messages, his brow furrowed. One part of him, the logical, business-minded part, looked for patterns, for consistency. The other, the paternal part, felt his heart break. At that moment, his phone rang. It was the head of the IT team. "Mr. Davenport, I have an update about the recordings because of the internet outage we had. Part of the upload to the local server failed. The connection was unstable." A chill went down Richard's spine. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. The voice on the other end hesitated. "It means the recording of the exact moment you requested might not exist." The shadows, which for a moment had seemed to recede, grew back, denser and more threatening than ever. Helen arrived on a Wednesday morning, bringing with her an air of serenity that seemed out of place in the mansion's heavy atmosphere. She was neither tall nor imposing, but her eyes, a deep and gentle brown, had the ability to see beyond appearances. Her first session with Clara didn't happen in the physical therapy room equipped with the latest devices, a recent investment by Richard, but on the veranda, far from the sight of the pool. They talked about books, about the stars, and about Clara's favorite color, which was the yellow of the golden chain trees that would soon bloom. Helen didn't ask direct questions about the accident. Instead, she observed. She observed how Clara's shoulders tensed when a gust of wind brought the scent of chlorine. She observed how her fingers tightened on the edge of the tablet when Beatrice's voice echoed from a distant room. They were small, almost invisible signs, but to a trained eye, they formed a clear map of fear. At the end of the session, Helen asked to speak with Richard alone. They met in his office, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather where decisions that moved millions in capital were made daily. "Mr. Davenport," she began, her voice soft but firm, "what I've observed in Clara is not just the trauma of a fall. These are clear signs of a learned fear, a pattern we see in situations of cohabitation with figures who exert control or intimidation." Richard felt his blood run cold. The word intimidation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He thought of his business deals, how he analyzed a company's assets and liabilities before closing a deal. Here, his most precious asset, his daughter, was the one at risk. Helen continued, "A direct confrontation now could be detrimental to her and would cause the source of the fear to become even more careful. The truth often reveals itself in small gestures, in spontaneous reactions. When vigilance is lowered," she paused, letting the words sink in. "My professional advice is observe without confronting." For Richard, a man of action accustomed to tackling problems head-on, the suggestion was torment. To pretend, to dissemble within his own home. It went against all his instincts. He spent the night sleepless, pacing his office, the illuminated city sprawling below his window. He thought of his net worth. Of all the wealth he had accumulated, what good was it if he couldn't guarantee the safety of his only daughter? Protecting Clara was the most important investment of his life, and like any good investment, it required strategy, patience, and sometimes sacrifice. At dawn, as the first rays of sun entered the room, he made a decision. It would be the hardest role of his life. He would pretend to believe Beatrice's narrative. He would let her lower her guard, let her feel secure, while he, in the shadows, would piece together the puzzle. It was the only way. A silent victory, but one that was already taking its toll. The next morning, at the breakfast table, he smiled at Beatrice. A small, tired smile, but one she interpreted as acceptance. Across the table, Clara saw the smile, and her world, which was already cracked, shattered into 1,000 pieces. Her father, the only safe harbor she had left, was smiling at the woman who had pushed her. The bitter taste in Clara's mouth wasn't from the orange juice. It was the taste of betrayal. The second week began under the sign of an artificial peace. Richard played his part with the precision of a veteran actor, exchanging morning pleasantries with Beatrice, discussing amenities about the stock market, and even complimenting her choices for dinner. On the outside, he was the husband who had accepted the fragile explanation of an accident. On the inside, every smile was a monumental effort, every cordial word a weight on his conscience. Beatrice flourished under this apparent normalcy. Believing she had dispelled any suspicion, she resumed her place as the lady of the mansion, organizing the couple's social calendar and supervising the staff with impeccable efficiency. For her, the crisis had passed. The truth had been conveniently buried under a layer of normalcy. But for Clara, her father's silence was louder than any accusation. She saw him laugh at one of Beatrice's jokes and felt her stomach churn. The betrayal was a deepening chasm between them, and loneliness had become her only companion. The pinnacle of this social charade occurred on Sunday, at the country club's traditional barbecue. The air was thick with the smell of grilled meat and the sound of a live country band that echoed among the tables filled with families. Men in polo shirts discussed the profitability of their investment funds and the ups and downs of the stock market, while their wives showed off jewelry and talked about their upcoming European vacations. It was a spectacle of wealth and carefree happiness. Beatrice was in her element, mingling with guests with a glass of wine in hand, her smile never faltering. She was the personification of a multi-millionaire's wife, elegant, sociable, and completely in control. Richard followed her like a shadow, shaking hands and nodding, while his eyes constantly searched for Clara, who remained quiet near the playground area, watching the other children run with a distant look. It was then that an unexpected figure approached him. Eleanor, an elderly neighbor with white hair and a sweet smile, who knew Clara from the music lessons the community offered. She approached discreetly as Richard poured himself a glass of water. "Excuse me, Mr. Davenport," she said in a low voice. "I don't mean to be nosy, but I'm very fond of your little girl. She has an artist's soul." Richard offered her a genuine smile, the first of the day. "She really does." Eleanor hesitated, her gaze shifting to where Beatrice was chatting animatedly. "I was on my porch a few days ago, the day of that scare. A little before, and I saw your wife with Clara near the pool. She seemed to be rushing things, pushing the pace of the girl's sun time on a day when no one else was out. Her expression was harsh." Richard's heart leaped. It was the first external piece of the puzzle. He remained calm, his mask of serenity intact. "I appreciate your concern, Eleanor. I'll be more observant." He thanked her and walked away. But her words echoed in his mind. That night, anxiety kept him awake. He went to his office and, on an impulse, called the IT technician. "Any news about the cameras?" he asked, as without much hope. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, The main video file is unrecoverable, but we were analyzing the device's internal memory, and we found something. Richard leaned over his desk, his heart racing. What? What did you find? The technician's voice sounded like a light at the end of the tunnel. Despite the upload failure, there are still local audio fragments. They're corrupted, but it might be possible to recover something. The sliver of hope the IT technician offered was thin, but to Richard, it was a steel cable. The possibility of recovering audio fragments changed his internal posture. His performance as the compliant husband became more focused, more strategic. He was no longer just waiting for the truth to appear, he was hunting it. Beatrice, with the sharp intuition of someone living under the risk of discovery, sensed the shift. It was nothing she could pinpoint, no specific word or gesture. It was a different stillness in Richard, a depth in his gaze that analyzed her even when he seemed to be reading the financial news. The artificial peace was thinning, and the air in the mansion, once just cold, now crackled with a subterranean tension. She felt the invisible net tightening and knew she needed a bolder maneuver, a new smokescreen so brilliant it would obscure any lingering suspicion. One afternoon, she opened the safe hidden in the back of her walk-in closet and removed a blue velvet box. Inside, on white satin, rested her heirlooms, a diamond necklace and a pair of solid gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. They were pieces that represented not just significant monetary value, but the security of a family legacy she had always been proud to possess. Looking at the sparkle of the stones, she hatched her plan. Later, during dinner, she announced her decision, her voice thick with feigned emotion. "Richard, darling, I've been thinking. What happened with Clara made me reevaluate everything. I want to do something good. Something that truly matters." She paused dramatically. "I've decided to sell my grandmother's jewelry. I'm going to donate the entire value to create an accessibility campaign at her school, so that no other child feels limited." Richard almost choked on his water. The nobility of the gesture was so grand, so public, that it contradicted the cruelty he suspected. He congratulated her, praised her altruism, while inside, an alarm bell sounded. The next day, Beatrice asked Anthony to drive her downtown to a jeweler known for his discretion and for dealing with large fortunes. Her haste was palpable. "I need an urgent appraisal, Anthony," she said, adjusting her sunglasses. Anthony, who had felt a knot in his stomach since the day of the incident, found her urgency strange. A donation was an act of patience, not desperation. He dropped her off at the shop door and discreetly noted the date and time in his notepad. That evening, he asked to speak with Richard, with the respect of one who knows his place but the loyalty of one who protects the family he serves. He reported the visit. "Sir, forgive my intrusion, but Mrs. Davenport seemed distressed, not like someone doing a good deed." The information was the piece Richard needed. After Anthony left, he locked himself in his office. He didn't call the school to confirm the supposed donation campaign. He knew he wouldn't find anything. Instead, he did what he did best. He followed the money. He pulled up the detailed statements for the household accounts, analyzing the cash flow of the last few months. And then he saw it. It wasn't a large diversion, nothing a cursory glance would notice. They were small transfers, piecemeal amounts, weekly to an unknown account, a slow, steady bleeding of his assets. The total, when added up, was considerable. The attempt to sell the jewelry now made perfect sense. It wasn't about charity, it was about liquidating a high-value asset for an escape, or to build her own capital far from his sight. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the computer screen reflected in his eyes. The woman he shared a home with wasn't just cruel, she was a thief. At the beginning of the third week, Helen proposed something bold. During one of her private conversations with Richard, in the solemn silence of his office, she outlined a plan that made his heart stop for a second. "We need to help Clara reclaim the pool area," she said. With her usual calm that barely concealed the force of her conviction, "I propose a simulation, a therapeutic exercise, completely safe, at the poolside, with lifeguards from the club, temporary barriers, everything under professional control." Richard stared at her, his mind racing, calculating the risks. It seemed like a high-return emotional investment, but with a devastating potential for loss. Helen seemed to read his thoughts. "The primary goal is therapeutic, but a secondary benefit," she added, choosing her words carefully, "will be to observe the spontaneous reactions of everyone involved, especially Beatrice. Controlling people often betray themselves when they believe the environment is in their favor." The idea was brilliant and terrifying. It was the first time he would move from defense to offense, albeit covertly. He agreed. The scene was set with the precision of a surgical operation. 2 lifeguards from the club, informed that it was a session to overcome aquatic trauma, positioned themselves discreetly. Colorful, floating barriers marked a safe area in the shallow end. The invitation to Beatrice was made by Richard, with a tone of calculated vulnerability. "Helen thinks it would be important for Clara to have the whole family's support. Your presence would be essential." Beatrice accepted immediately, her eyes shining with the opportunity. It would be the perfect scene, the dedicated stepmother supporting her stepdaughter's recovery, erasing once and for all any lingering doubt. What she didn't know was that, a few yards away, on a small garden table, Clara's tablet was active again, positioned to look casual. This time, however, it was equipped with a directional microphone and was recording in the background. On the other side of the house, in the security control room, the IT team was running audio capture tests, trying to filter out the noise of the wind and water, a technical challenge they embraced as a personal mission. The simulation began. Clara, wearing a flotation vest over her swimsuit, sat on the edge, her feet barely touching the water. Her body was rigid, her breathing shallow. Helen spoke to her in a low, reassuring voice. Richard watched from a few feet away, his face impassive, but his hands were clenched into fists inside his pockets. Beatrice, at his side, sighed and made overly loud comments of encouragement. "You're so brave, my love. We're all here for you." When, after long minutes, Clara finally slid into the water, her body trembling with fear, Beatrice saw her chance to shine. She moved away from Richard and approached the edge of the pool, crouching down near her stepdaughter. Believing that the distance and the sound of the pool filter would protect her, she leaned her head in and whispered, the smile on her face contrasting with the venom in her words. "Stop this ridiculous drama. No one's going to fall for your act forever." The effect was immediate. Clara flinched, a spasm of pure panic that made her swallow water. Across the pool, one of the lifeguards, a young, attentive man, saw the gesture, the whisper, and the girl's reaction. His eyes met Richard's and he gave an almost imperceptible nod. He had seen it. At that exact moment, the phone in Richard's pocket vibrated. A text message from the head of IT. He opened it, his heart pounding erratically. The message contained just 3 words: "We got it clean." The sound of Beatrice's voice, clear and cruel, filled Richard's headphones. He was in his office, the door locked, an untouched glass of scotch on the mahogany desk. The IT team had sent him the isolated audio file. He listened to it once, twice, 10 times. "Stop this ridiculous drama. No one's going to fall for your act forever." There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was the proof, the validation of his darkest suspicion filled him not with relief, but with a cold nausea. He felt fury build in his chest, a primitive urge to go downstairs and confront her, to rip the mask from her face and expose the lie. But Helen's voice echoed in his mind. A direct confrontation now could be detrimental to her. Protecting Clara was the main objective. Justice would come later, calculated, like one of his long-term investments where patience yields the greatest dividends. He took a deep breath, picked up the phone and called the head of his team. "I have a new audio file. I want you to compare it with the fragments you recovered from the day of the push. See if the words fit, if we can form a complete sentence. Her voice is our signature." Later that night, the mansion was steeped in a tense silence. The simulation, though a technical success, had left Clara emotionally exhausted. Richard found her in her room, looking out the window into the darkness of the garden, the pool covered by a safety tarp like a guarded secret. He approached slowly, his heart heavy with unspoken words. He wanted to kneel, to hold her and say, "I know everything. I believe you. Justice will be done." But he couldn't. Not yet. The betrayal she saw in his eyes was the price he had to pay to maintain his strategy. "You were very brave today," he said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. Clara didn't turn around, she just shrugged. The small, indifferent gesture was more painful to Richard than any shout. He, a man who had built an empire, who managed assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, felt powerless to fix the most valuable thing he owned, his daughter's trust. Meanwhile, Beatrice, in her closet, felt a growing unease. Her performance at the pool had been impeccable, but something about Richard's calm unsettled her. He wasn't relieved as he should have been. He was focused, like when he was about to close a big deal or liquidate stocks before a market dip. Her survival instinct, honed by years of deception, pinged. She began to replay the events, searching for flaws in her plan. And then she thought of Anthony, the groundskeeper. He had been there from day one, with his quiet, observant gaze. He was loyal to Richard, an old employee who had watched Clara grow up. He was a risk, a liability in her personal accounting. She needed to ensure his silence, to reinforce his loyalty to the order of the house, her order. From her phone, she typed a message to him, choosing her words with the care of a sniper. It wasn't an explicit threat, but a veiled intimidation, a reminder of who held the power. "Anthony, loyalty is a valuable commodity. Remember that your well-being and that of your family depend on the peace of this house. Some things are best forgotten." She hit send, feeling a surge of control. What Beatrice didn't know was that, due to a recent corporate security policy, Anthony's number had been mirrored on Richard's system at the exact instant the message arrived on the groundskeeper's phone. An identical copy materialized in a secure folder on Richard's computer, accompanied by a discreet audio alert. Anthony read the message under the dim light of the porch of his small house at the back of the property. Beatrice's words were like shards of ice, cold and sharp. "Remember that your well-being and that of your family depend on the peace of this house." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, a threat wrapped in silk. For years, he had served this family with quiet dedication, tending the garden that was his pride, keeping the mansion running with discreet efficiency. He had seen Clara arrive, a baby in the arms of Richard's first wife, and loved her with a grandfatherly affection. The peace of this house, for him, was not the silence imposed by fear, but the sound of Clara's laughter echoing through the halls. The message placed him at a painful crossroads: loyalty to the employer who provided his livelihood, and protection for the girl he considered part of his own family. But deep down, the choice was already made. The image of Clara, trembling and soaked in his arms, was more powerful than any threat. The next morning, with a heavy heart, he waited for Richard to head to the garage and approached him. He didn't say a word, just handed him his phone, Beatrice's message glowing on the screen. Richard read the words and felt a new wave of fury, this time cold and calculating. It was confirmation of a pattern: intimidation, manipulation, control. Beatrice wasn't just trying to cover up an act of cruelty, she was actively corrupting the environment around her. "Thank you, Anthony. You did the right thing," he said, his voice grave. The message was another piece of the puzzle, but it also brought a painful, unforeseen consequence. That afternoon, Helen, the therapist, called him for a chat. "Richard, Clara's emotional state has worsened," she said, concern creasing her forehead. "She feels guilty." She overheard a conversation between staff members about the pressure Beatrice is applying. She thinks people are being threatened because of her. The revelation hit Richard like a punch. In his search for proof, in his strategy of waiting for the right moment, he had allowed the poison to spread, contaminating not only his relationship with his daughter, but the well-being of innocent people. Worse, the burden of guilt now rested on Clara's fragile shoulders. He found his daughter in the small music studio, her fingers hovering over the keys of an electric piano. The afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "I don't want to anymore," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't want to go to the pool anymore. I don't want any more sessions with Helen. I just want it all to stop." The desire to give up was in her eyes, a profound weariness that no child should feel. At that moment, two great obstacles rose before Richard, as clear and imposing as mountains. The first was how to prove the truth without dragging his daughter into the center of a hurricane, without re-victimizing her with testimonies and accusations. The second, perhaps even more complex, was how to break Beatrice's cycle of manipulation in a way she couldn't twist, a way she couldn't paint herself as the victim of a misunderstanding. For Clara, the obstacles were just as immense. Crossing the pool during therapy had become a metaphor for crossing her own fear, and, more importantly, she needed to find a reason to trust her father's word again. Nothing was simple. Every small step forward was paid for with sleepless nights, with the scent of chamomile tea that wafted through the house, a vain attempt to calm frayed nerves, and with the prayers the old housekeeper whispered in the girl's room. Where a porcelain angel seemed to watch over the headboard, Richard felt like a man spinning plates on thin sticks. On one side, the heavy plate of evidence, the audio from the simulation, the intimidating texts, the financial diversions. On the other, the delicate, priceless plate of his daughter's well-being, and in the center, him, trying to keep everything in the air without letting anything shatter, his business world, with its investment strategies and asset analysis, seemed like child's play in comparison. He spent hours in his office, not looking at the euro exchange rate or the performance of his funds, but at a single folder on his computer, a digital file that contained the ugliness hidden beneath the beauty of his home. He knew he had enough power, a fortune that could move mountains, but he realized with painful clarity that his true wealth, his greatest asset, was upstairs, locked in a room, afraid to live. The first glimmer of light came in a mid-afternoon call from the head of IT. "Mr. Davenport, we've had a significant breakthrough," the voice said, charged with professional excitement. "We used the clean audio we recorded at the simulation as a kind of key, a template of your wife's voice. With that, we were able to filter the noise and corruption from the audio fragments from the day of the accident." Richard held his breath. "And what did you get?" he asked, his voice tense. "It's not a full sentence," the technician admitted, "but it's unmistakable. We managed to isolate 3 words, spoken in the same harsh tone as the second audio. So much trouble." The phrase echoed in Richard's mind, instantly connecting to Beatrice's whispered line about Clara needing to learn not to be so much trouble. It wasn't the confession he'd dreamed of, but it was a steel beam in the structure of his case, a piece that linked intent to action. That night, he tried to rebuild a bridge across the chasm that separated him from Clara. He knocked gently on her door and found her sitting by the window, watching the moon. He said nothing about the investigations, about the silent battle he was waging. He just pulled up a chair and sat beside her, the silence filling the space between them. After long minutes, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "I know things are hard, And I know it seems like I'm not seeing it, but I'm here, sweetheart. I will always be here, and we are going to fix this. Together. Clara didn't reply, but for the first time in days, she didn't flinch. She just kept looking at the moon, but the rigidity in her shoulders seemed to lessen, if only slightly. It was a start. Later, Beatrice found him in the library. She had swapped her performance as the concerned stepmother for that of the wounded wife. "Richard, this house is becoming impossible," she said, her eyes welling up. "I feel the staff looking at me sideways. Clara won't speak to me. What have I done to deserve this treatment?" Richard looked at her, and for the first time, there was no conflict in his eyes, only a cold clarity. He didn't answer, and his silence was more frightening to her than any accusation. The third week was ending when Richard's phone rang again. It was the head of IT, and this time, his voice held not just excitement, it held astonishment. "Sir, you're not going to believe this. The audio was just the beginning." Richard straightened in his chair. "What do you mean?" The voice on the other end paused, as if to give the next words more weight. "We were doing a deep scan of the garden camera's internal memory, looking for more fragments, and we found it, a video file. It was marked as corrupted and queued to be overwritten. But the process failed. It wasn't completely deleted." Richard felt his blood rush. "We don't know yet," the technician cut in. "But the file is here, and we think we can recover the image." The wait for the result of the video recovery was one of the longest in Richard's life. Every passing hour seemed to stretch into an eternity of suspense. He tried to distract himself with stock market reports and new business proposals, but the words and numbers danced meaninglessly before him. His focus, his true emotional capital, was entirely invested in that one corrupted video file. Helen, the therapist, advised him to maintain his routine, to not let the tension show. "The truth needs an emotionally stable foundation to be revealed, Richard, especially for Clara." He understood the advice. The revelation, when it came, needed to be an act of healing, not of revenge. So he decided to wait a few more days, even with his heart in his throat. His daughter's safety came before his need for justice. While the IT team worked tirelessly, life in the mansion continued its bizarre choreography of forced normalcy. Beatrice, sensing the change in the air, redoubled her efforts to appear the victim. She spent hours on the phone with friends, complaining just loud enough to be overheard, talking about Clara's difficult phase and Richard's distance. She cooked his favorite meals, wore her best dresses, and filled the house with flowers in a desperate attempt to rebuild the crumbling facade. But her gestures were empty. Her words found no echo. Richard's silence was an impenetrable wall. Clara, for her part, lived in a world of her own. She had resumed her sessions with Helen, but hesitantly, like someone testing the water temperature with their toe. She spent most of her time in her room, drawing on her tablet. They were strange drawings, full of abstract shapes and dark colors, but Helen saw a narrative in them, a way of processing what words could not say. The call that would change everything came on a Thursday afternoon, just as the fourth week began to dawn. "We got it," the head of IT said, his voice exhausted but triumphant. "It's not perfect. The image glitches, there are lines, but it's clear. We can see everything." Richard closed his eyes, a wave of relief and dread washing over him. "Send it to me, only to me," he ordered. The file arrived seconds later. He clicked it open with a trembling finger. The image flickered, but it was there. The edge of the pool, the wheelchair, the elegant figure of Beatrice behind it, and then the push. There was no sound, just the quick, deliberate movement. The image was the final piece, the one that connected the financial diversions, the intimidating messages, the audio fragments, and the cruel whisper into an undeniable sequence of intent and action. There was no longer a shadow of a doubt. It was the truth, raw and naked, in distorted pixels. That night, The atmosphere in the mansion grew thick, almost unbreathable. The wind shifted, whistling through the window cracks, and outside, the neighborhood's first golden chain trees began to burst into yellow bloom, a vibrant, painful contrast to the grey domestic mood. Richard knew the moment had come. He could no longer delay. He spoke at length with Helen, devising a plan for the following evening. It would be a carefully orchestrated event, not to humiliate, but to establish the truth, to break the cycle of manipulation once and for all. Later, he went to Clara's room. She was already almost asleep. He sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand. "Tomorrow night, we're going to watch a movie in the home theater. Like old times," he said, his voice soft. "I need you to be there. I need you to be strong, because tomorrow, the world is going to believe you." Clara looked at him, her eyes sleepy, but for an instant, a glimmer of hope seemed to spark in her darkness. She squeezed his hand, a fragile but real gesture of trust, the first major dividend of his painful investment. The movie night was announced with a naturalness that bordered on the surreal. Richard mentioned the plan at breakfast, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, a return to the family's old customs. "I thought we could watch that classic Clara loves, with popcorn and blankets, like we used to." Beatrice, completely disarmed by the simplicity of the invitation, smiled, feeling a pang of triumph. To her, this was an armistice. Richard's white flag, a sign that he was finally tiring of the drama and ready to resume the luxurious, comfortable life she so cherished. Confident, she spent the afternoon getting ready, choosing an elegant dress and discreet jewelry, as if preparing for a theater premiere. Her role that night would be that of the matriarch reuniting her family, the peacemaker. Clara, on the other hand, felt every minute drag by with an anxiety that chilled her hands. Her father had asked her to be strong, and she clung to that phrase like a mantra. She wanted to see, needed to see. If the silent promise in his eyes was real, when evening fell, the mansion's home theater was ready. The projection screen took up an entire wall, and the state-of-the-art sound system was capable of reproducing everything from the subtlest whisper to the most thunderous explosion. Richard personally made the popcorn, the smell of melted butter spreading through the house, an olfactory memory of happier times. He handed a bowl to Clara, who settled into her chair in a corner of the sofa, and another to Beatrice, who sat gracefully beside him, exuding perfume and self-assurance. "I'm so glad we're doing this, darling," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "I've missed these moments." Richard just nodded, his face a mask of calm. He picked up the remote control, and the lights slowly dimmed, plunging the room into shadow, but it wasn't the opening credits of an old movie that appeared on the screen. The first image was of the garden, filmed from a high angle. The day was sunny. Beatrice frowned, confused. "Is this the security camera?" Before Richard could answer, the scene began to unfold. The image, cleaned up and stabilized by the IT team, showed Beatrice walking up to Clara's wheelchair. The sound, amplified and crystal clear, filled the room. It wasn't a movie, it was reality. Beatrice's voice, harsh and hissing, echoed through the room. "You need to learn not to be so much trouble." Then, the recovered audio fragment was inserted, completing the thought, "If your father spends a fortune to maintain all this luxury, and you just get in the way." The camera then focused on the movement of Beatrice's hands on the handles, the push, the sharp sound of the chair accelerating, the splash in the water. There were no screams. There was calculation. The recording continued, showing Beatrice's rehearsed panic. Her cries of "she slipped" to Anthony, the truth in all its ugliness as was there, projected in giant size, undeniable. The color drained from Beatrice's face, turning it into a waxen mask. The terror of exposure replaced her arrogance. She leaped to her feet, the popcorn bowl tumbling onto the carpet. "What kind of joke is this, Richard? Turn this off right now." She tried to run for the door, but her path was blocked by a tall, impassive figure. It was the head of the gated community's security. Richard had called him beforehand, not for aggression, but to ensure the encounter ended without incident, to be a neutral witness. The moment of truth had arrived. Richard stood, walked over to Clara and knelt beside her, placing his hands on hers. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes moist but his voice as firm as steel. "It's over, Beatrice." Then he turned to his daughter, and the words she had been waiting to hear for 4 long weeks finally came. "I believe you, sweetheart. I should have always believed you. I failed you by doubting, and I am so sorry," he finished, his gaze returning to the woman paralyzed near the door. "From now on, the rules of this house are changing." Beatrice's departure from the mansion was marked not by screams or scandals, but by a heavy, definitive silence. In the presence of the community's security chief and her own lawyer, whom Richard had discreetly summoned, she collected her most personal belongings. Each linen dress, each piece of gold jewelry, each pair of designer shoes now seemed like a prop from a play that had reached its end. There was no apology, only the vacant stare of someone utterly unmasked. Richard made a conscious, painful choice. He would not press criminal charges. The thought of dragging Clara through long hearings, of making her relive the trauma repeatedly before strangers, was unbearable. Instead, his lawyers filed a civil suit, seeking damages and the dissolution of their marriage, using the irrefutable evidence to secure a swift and quiet settlement. Justice would be served, but on his terms, prioritizing his daughter's emotional health above all else. Protecting Clara's emotional assets had become more important than any public punishment. In the first few days, the house felt too big, the echo of Richard's footsteps on the marble floors sounding like an accusation. The void left by Beatrice was strange, an absence that paradoxically took up immense space. Clara felt it too. The relief of the revealed truth was mixed with a diffuse melancholy. The house, the stage for her pain, now needed to become a home again. Richard realized the real rebuilding was just beginning. He cancelled trips, postponed meetings, and reorganized his company's schedule, facing veiled criticism from partners and colleagues who couldn't understand why a billionaire would pass up profit opportunities for domestic issues. For him, however, the biggest deal of his life was being present. He started having breakfast with Clara every day, unhurried, and helped her with her homework at night, rediscovering the simple rhythm of fatherhood. Helen, the therapist, proposed a plan for aquatic rehabilitation, a gradual and symbolic return to the site of the trauma. The first sessions took place at the country club, a setting that had once brought pain, but now offered a support network. With the help of the same lifeguards who had witnessed the simulation, the program began. Clara wore a flotation vest, and the music playing in the background wasn't the upbeat country music from the barbecues, but old standards played on an electric piano, soft melodies her grandfather used to whistle. Gradually, the neighborhood subplots began to connect to this journey of healing. Eleanor, the elderly neighbor, started attending some sessions from the poolside, sitting in a wicker chair, telling stories of when she learned to swim as a young woman in the river of her childhood. Her narratives about overcoming the fear of the current became small fables of resilience for Clara. Anthony, the groundskeeper, who had received a raise and the title of property maintenance manager, helped install new access ramps and automatic safety covers on the mansion's pool, transforming the physical space into a reflection of the house's new priority, Clara's safety and well-being. The school, moved by the story that had spread quietly through the community, created an accessibility week, and in an act of courage that surprised everyone, especially herself, Clara asked to speak. With her voice still trembling but present, she read a short text she had written on her tablet, talking about fear, about the importance of having someone who believes in you, and about how courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going even when you're afraid. It was the first time she had spoken in public, and every word was a victory. The small victories, however, were won at a high emotional cost. Each step forward seemed to demand a tribute of tears or anxiety. Clara's first attempt to cross the pool at the club ended halfway, with a silent panic attack that left her breathless. Richard, watching from the edge, felt his own heart falter, but he followed Helen's guidance. He didn't interfere, allowing the therapist and the lifeguard to calmly lead her out of the water. That night, Clara cried herself to sleep. The second attempt, days later, was a success. She reached the other side, but the emotional exhaustion left her drained for the rest of the day. It was on the third crossing that something shifted. She not only went across, but she came back, the movement of her arms finding a rhythm, a cadence in the water. At the end, there was no applause, no celebration. Richard simply knelt, held her wet hand, and promised, "I'll be here tomorrow too." That promise, the consistency of his presence, became the true foundation of her recovery. He paid the price for it, losing a major contract in Asia because he refused to travel. But the loss of a few million from his cash flow seemed insignificant compared to the gain of a single confident smile from his daughter. At the end of the fourth week, the afternoon sun fell on the mansion's backyard, the same yard where the injustice had been born. The hydrangeas swayed in the breeze, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine began to fill the air. There was no party or ceremony. Quietly, Richard launched what he called the Clear Waters Program, a community project funded by him and the country club to offer free aquatic rehabilitation for children with reduced mobility. The mansion's pool, now completely renovated, was the heart of the project. It had stainless steel handrails, an access lift, non-slip flooring, and a modern automatic cover that closed when it detected the absence of a responsible monitor. Everything that had been presented in the story as a tool of oppression or investigation, the technology, the security, the club, the wealth, had been repurposed, transformed into an instrument of healing and altruism. To the distant sound of a soap opera playing in the club's lounge on the other side of the hedge, Clara entered the water, wearing her vest. She no longer needed it, but it gave her comfort, like a security blanket. Richard watched from a distance, his hands in his pockets to hide his trembling, while Helen guided the girl with her calm voice. The crossing was slow, the water rippling gently around her. Her wrinkled fingers touched the opposite edge. There was no burst of victory, no cries of joy. There was a dense, sacred silence, filled only by the sound of water. Then, Clara turned in the pool and looked at her father. No speeches, no elaborate words. She simply opened her arms. Richard walked to the edge, knelt on the grass, getting his linen pants wet without a care, and hugged her. A hug that contained an apology, an acceptance of guilt, and an unshakable commitment to the future. Only then, in the final moments, did the emotional reward arrive, not just for them, but for anyone watching. The certainty that justice, human, domestic, sensitive, had been done, and that love, when it learns from pain, has the power to rearrange the house, the pool, and the soul.